Matthew 1:23. What is interesting is to look at they shall call. They shall call his name Emmanuel, because in the Hebrew it's you shall call. You shall call, not they shall call. So there is a difference between the Septuagint and the Hebrew. Now, what's interesting, and I told you there's some cool background stuff here, even if you're not necessarily into textual criticism, there's some other stuff here it's worthwhile learning. What's interesting is you don't have this with Erasmus, but by the time you get to Beza, you are seeing the formulation and foundation of what we would call Reformed Orthodoxy. Beza is important in that. He's a huge step in the codification, filling out the teachings and the positions of his mentor, John Calvin. And that impacts how Beza does textual criticism. So one of the ways that it impacts how he does textual criticism is in light of the argument with Rome now, the supremacy of the Hebrew truth, the Hebrew text, is being held to by the Reformed over against any differences with the Greek Septuagint, which is problematic because the New Testament writers quote the Septuagint. And so Beza, for example, one of the things that Beza does over and over again, and this again is so contrary to the argumentation of the TR guys today, is Beza's comments are filled with his saying, well, this reading probably was a marginal gloss that was brought into the text. Dozens of times Beza will say this, even if we don't have any evidence of it. He will look to harmonize text based upon the conjecture of a marginal gloss. And when we get to this, he simply doesn't like the idea that Matthew could write, they will call his name Emmanuel, rather than you will call his name Emmanuel. And so he says that this should be changed to the second person singular, kalesais, from kalesusin, or kalesusi in the TR that didn't include the movable nu. So Kron says, this incongruity is more than Beza is willing to accept. He adopts kalesais, translated as vocabis, already in 1556. In 1556, he justifies this editorial intervention as follows. I know that in most copies, kai kalesusi is read, that is, and they will call, and he, Jesus, will be called, which reading was also followed by Justin Martyr. But as our Stephanus noted, that some old copies agree with the Hebrew, and as great force would seem to lie in this apostrophe by the prophet, seized by God's Spirit, in which he addresses himself to the Virgin, who would be born so many centuries later as if she were present, I have followed my own judgment in this matter, without, in my opinion, any damage to the meaning. From Stephanus' edition, Beza could only know that kalesais is the reading in Stephanus' second manuscript. That is, Codex Beza. This is one of those situations where Beza himself did not realize that Stephanus, his second manuscript, had now been given to Beza. And so he's thinking that this is two texts that have the same reading, when it's only one. It is not likely that Henri's collations, Stephanus' son did further collations that Beza had access to, contain further attestations for this reading. In 1582, a remarkable change takes place. Beza still points out that kalesusi is the best attested reading. both in Greek manuscripts and patristic sources, but now he drops the reference to following his own judgment and writes as follows. Now listen to this, folks. This is important. But it is preferable to follow the received reading. Let me read that again. But it is preferable to follow the received reading so that it is an apostrophe of the prophet seized by God's Spirit in which he addresses himself to the virgin who would be born so many centuries later as if she were present, which has great force. With the received reading, Beza obviously intends kolesais, his conjecture, based upon his understanding of the Hebrew. This change in Beza's annotation was commented on very critically already by Wettstein, since within a few decades, a very weakly attested reading is turned into the received one. Beza actually does not hide the fact that the reading is weakly attested, but it remains remarkable that he can treat a reading adopted by himself as received. It wasn't received. Received by whom? And what caught my attention here was that so many of these young guys that are buying into, hey, you know, if all I've got's this, then I don't have to worry about textual criticism anymore, and I can just preach this, and I don't have to worry about those footnotes. It's the received text after all. Received by whom? Received by whom, guys? I mean, if Beza can refer to a reading that he himself adopted, Kranz points out a couple of times where, you know, the difference between 1516 and 1535, that's 19 years. You forget what you did 19 years ago. There were times that Erasmus thought that Greek manuscripts supported his reading when that was where he had messed up 15 years earlier and just didn't realize it. Beza did the same thing. So now Beza calls a reading that he thinks should be there the received reading when it wasn't received by anybody but himself. And that's the other thing, but it says kalesusi in the TR. Right, because there's still a next step of interpretation, which is going to be the King James translators. So they have to decide between Beza and Stephanos and Stephanos and Erasmus and so on and so forth. But Beza and Erasmus, numerous times in their annotations and their comments, said, leave it to the reader. It could be this, it could be that. Man, we do that today, and you're casting doubt on the word of God and all the rest of this type of stuff. They did it all the time. They did it all the time. So it just struck me that here Beza could go, the received reading. Received by whom? Over what period of time? Based on what? Erasmus had a significantly more developed textual critical methodology. That is an interest in manuscripts, not so much manuscripts. Nobody really had an interest in manuscripts at this point. Much more of an interest in the scribal activities. Erasmus went much more into depth into various kinds of scribal errors. Beza just sort of lumped them all into, marginal glosses that ended up being brought into the text, something like that. In fact, what's fascinating, in his first edition, Beza individually identifies the various manuscripts as Stephanos lists, and then he goes, that's too much of a bother. I'm just going to say in certain manuscripts. So you don't even know which one he's referring to. He became less specific over time rather than more specific. They don't care about what manuscripts they are, what quality they are. There's no analysis of any of these things that we do regularly in textual criticism today. It's not present. It's not present. And this is why fundamentally, when you push on all these things, the only logical place for the TR guys to go is to abandon any historical battle at all and to completely theologize this. To create a theology of providential preservation, and I'm just simply going to say, this is it. That's what Doug Wilson did. When I pushed him in the book, which one? 1550 Stephanos. Why? Because it looks good. That's all you can do. There's no, you don't have a methodology that can actually answer that question. You just have to just go, 1550 Stephanos. That's what we're going to go with. That's all you've got. You don't have anything else. Don't pretend you've got something you don't have. You don't have any basis for saying 1550 versus the third edition of Erasmus versus the second edition of Beza or finally the Trinitarian Bible study. Why not just do what Peter Ruckman did? Peter Ruckman described a process of purification all the way through to the Scofield Reference Bible. That's the final stage of the process of the purification of the text. Why not do that? It has as much basis in history. It's all just a leap of faith that says, well, I'm going to identify this one. That's where I'm going to put my foot down here. Boom. And then just defend that one. But you don't defend it historically. Don't even bother to defend it historically. You have no reason to defend it historically. Just simply say, nope, I can't answer those questions. I can't talk about where it came from. I can't talk about how Erasmus came up with the reading or Beza came up. It doesn't matter. I'm just simply taking this as my final authority. And I think you should too. I can't tell you why, which is why I have said from the start, this movement is absolutely destructive to any meaningful apologetics. Because it is. That's all there is to it.